This podcast is proudly supported by the University Students' Council at Western University. Please note that the content of this podcast in no way constitutes medical advice or instruction. Should you have health-related questions or concerns, please contact your physician. Hi, you're listening to the #Health Podcast. In this episode, we're going to discuss a topic that is maybe a little bit more taboo. We're talking about the P word. It's something that nobody talks about, but it's definitely no stranger to some of us. Yeah, porn. Specifically, internet porn addiction. Did you know that 40 million adults in the US visit internet pornography sites? Or that 1 in 5 internet searches on mobile devices are for porn? Porn addiction is considered to be a subset of sex addiction. While it's not a formal diagnosis that's cataloged in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM-5, there's a growing subset of people who claim that they're seriously impaired by what they feel is porn addiction. This has been taken to the extreme with what is colloquially known as the NoFap movement. People who are part of the NoFap community call themselves Fapstronauts. On the NoFap website, it states that watching internet porn affects the neural pathways in the brain, causing addiction, hormonal changes, and sexual dysfunction. So, by rebooting themselves through abstinence from pornography, masturbation, and sometimes even sex, which is called hard mode, Fapstronauts can free themselves and ultimately live their best lives. Indeed, many people claim to have benefited from improved confidence, better cognition, improved immunity, and even a more masculine appearance, which they attribute to having higher levels of testosterone. While NoFap is a growing community, there's been some criticism from members of the healthcare community. So today, we're going to explore the evidence both in support of and against porn addiction, its history, and of course, we can't forget the Fapstronauts. We have to admit though, we had a hard time finding someone to speak in support of porn addiction. So we'll be presenting most of those ideas ourselves, adapted from the websites like NoFap and Fight the New Drug, as well as the current literature. So before we get into our guest interviews, we wanted to outline some of the main tenets in support of the anti-porn ideas. Okay, so the first argument is that porn is habit forming and is an escalating behavior. According to the Fight the New Drug website, as porn consumers develop a tolerance to the porn they usually watch, meaning that it becomes boring to them, they begin seeking out more hardcore types of porn, or they try to watch increasing amounts of porn. The evidence cited to back this idea is related to two brain systems, the liking system and the wanting system. Their website says that with more and more porn consumption over time, the liking system becomes blunted and the wanting system becomes more intensified. The difference between liking and wanting is that the feeling of liking is one of pleasure, which is thought to be the ignition fueling the early stages of addiction, whereas the feeling of wanting is what precedes liking. It's what makes you crave the pleasurable liking experience and is often incited by triggers like certain smells or places. However, when we looked into the articles that they were citing, we found that one of them, titled Neurobiologic Advances from the Brain Disease Model of Addiction, actually distinguishes that the reward pattern of dopamine firing actually stops after repeated consumption of a natural reward, and specifically provides examples like food and sex. The authors of that study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, described that that's the difference between why people become addicted to drugs more easily, because the dopamine circuit circumvents natural satiation. The next important point is that porn changes the brain. If you do some Googling, you'll find that many anti-porn sites will mention a chemical called delta-phos-B in any setting, not just porn consumption. Delta-phos-B functions as a molecular switch that gradually turns acute drug responses into relatively stable neural adaptations thought to underlie addiction. While most research out there on delta-phos-B is looking at changes in response to drugs like heroin or amphetamines, there's a growing number of studies with correlational evidence of natural rewards, mostly food, doing the same exact thing. The last thing we'll go over is that many people who have chosen to go porn free have done so because they themselves have felt that there was something seriously wrong. Many people feel that porn has hurt their relationship with their partner, making them more critical of their partner and viewing them as less sexually attractive. There are also studies showing that people who use porn are more likely to experience trust and infidelity issues. Okay, so now that we've covered that, our first guest is Dr. Guy Grenier, who likes to go as Dr. Guy. Dr. Guy is a psychologist based in London, Ontario, who specializes in relationships and sexuality. Dr. Guy has a diverse client base, but has found that over the years, more and more people are coming to see him about sex and porn addiction.
If I make up a number, I'm going to say 50% of the time, it's men who have been told they have to come here by their partners. And the other 50% of the time, it's men who feel guilty or shameful. They have strong religious beliefs. They've read an article. There was something on Oprah. And they worry about their sexual behavior. And actually, let me qualify that. So that would be 40%. The other 10% are men with premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, that worry that their poor ejaculatory control or their distrust of their ability to maintain an erection is due to their use of porn.
Here's the thing though, even though Dr. Guy lists porn addiction as an area of focus on his website, he doesn't actually believe in it. Yeah, Dr. Guy says that the people who believe they are addicted to porn usually present with another underlying issue that is the actual culprit of whatever problems they're having, but they themselves will believe that they're addicted to porn. He says that they usually end up being managed, counseled, or treated for something else that's not actually addiction related.
Well, it isn't cookie cutter. It isn't formulaic. You need to do the full psychological assessment. You need to do a full sexual assessment to find out what's going on. Somewhere in there, and this is always the case whenever you're doing a sex piece, there's a big chunk of sex ed that has to happen. But invariably, we make a distinction between addiction, as it's more typically known, alcohol addiction, opioid, nicotine, things like that. Invariably, in fact, with 100% consistency, when somebody comes in here with a, and I'm air quoting, porn addiction, we resolve their issue and we don't resolve it within an addiction format. Generally, we resolve it in the overuse of a perfectly good coping mechanism. We normalize masturbation. We normalize the idea of looking at pretty naked people, and we put it in context, and we identify issues that are about depression, about anxiety, about relationship issues, about eroticizing relationships, about guilt and shame, about sexuality, about erotophobia, on and on and on and on and on. So it isn't one thing, like everybody comes in and they're really depressed, or actually they've got GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, or something like that. It's different every time. But the answer is never about demonizing sex, demonizing masturbation, demonizing sexually explicit material. If anything, we work to normalize that stuff, which causes problems in the relationship sometimes. And then you bring the partner in. But then it's not my job to tell somebody what their morals and their ethics. If somebody is opposed to pornography, if they don't like it, it's not my job to make them like it. But even then, we talk about different forms of sexual expression, different kinds of stimulus material, what it means and what it doesn't mean. Their primary motivation is to save their relationship. And they want to save their relationship, otherwise they wouldn't endure a schlub like me. They don't think they need therapy, or they're profoundly embarrassed. They're adult men believing, for the most part, they're engaging in a childish or adolescent kind of behavior, because it isn't the sexually explicit material, it's the masturbation that goes along with that. And that's usually the biggest part of the guilt or the shame. and trying to fit masturbatory behavior into a healthy sex life, into a healthy dyadic sex life, a married or a partnered sex life, that becomes the objective. And people will come in and say, well, I want to stop doing porn, I want to do an abstinence program. And the same way people will come in, and there are parallels that we can use. That people come in and say, well, I want to quit drinking. And so then we start talking about it, and we say, well, abstinence is certainly a way to go. We could also talk about harm reduction. And of course, when people say, I want to do the abstinence model, it is often the case, abstinence doesn't work. And certainly trying to masturbate, or trying not to masturbate for the rest of your life, doesn't work. And so all of that feeds into guilt, shame, misunderstandings. Women will send their partners here. He's not attracted to me. He doesn't want to have sex with me. I can't compete with all the young women on the internet, and of course nobody could. This is going to ruin our marriage. It's going to ruin our children. All of these things. So, there.
Do you think that, I guess, the rise in numbers of people who think that they are addicted to porn is partially due to a decline in the quality or quantity of sex ed in, I guess, the educational system?
Most of the negative outcomes that have to do with sex, so STIs, pregnancies, coercive sex, have to do with poor education. And the graph, it's a shame this is a radio, but you know the what is it, the EC 20 graph, the economics 20 graph, where there's price and demand, and as price goes up, demand goes down. It's this X. Okay, that's the sex education graph.
Dr. Guy goes on to explain that one of the reasons why more and more people believe they're addicted to porn is because of a decline in the quality and quantity of sex education that's easily accessible by the public. In addition to that, he says that when sex education is low, we see a rise in negative outcomes like STIs, unwanted pregnancies, and coercive sex.
The graph is actually the same when it comes to sexually explicit material. We've just done this experiment over the last 20 years where high quality, ubiquitous sexually explicit images are now available for free, anonymously, and at no charge. What have we seen with assault, suicides, rape? It's gone down. So if the sexually explicit material was causing these negative outcomes, which the anti-porn advocates will claim, it's corrupting youth, it's corrupting society, it's causing more of this. Well, then how come the data show exactly the opposite? Masturbation is just a good, natural, normal behavior. It's the aspirin of sex therapy. But yeah, if you think it's sinful, if you think it's dirty, if you think it's immature, if you think it's cheating, of course. And we see that in other things. I mean, people with eating disorders, they've got this hostile relationship with food. They see food as dangerous, food is bad, food is adversarial. And yet, I've got to eat or I'm going to die. And it creates profound conflict.
In the next little segment, Dr. Guy talks about withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms are usually used to characterize drug addiction. Take alcohol withdrawal syndrome, for example. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant that makes the person drinking it feel euphoria and excitation due to decreased activity of the neurotransmitter glutamate and increased activity of the neurotransmitter GABA. This in turn causes increased dopamine in the reward centers of the brain, like the nucleus accumbens. As you may know already, chronic use or even short-term overdrinking can lead to tolerance, which involves your brain making compensatory changes, like more or less receptors that can bind to the glutamate or GABA. These changes are unmasked when the user abruptly stops drinking alcohol. Basically, it's compensating for a change that's not even there anymore. This is the reason for the withdrawal symptoms that you see in alcohol withdrawal syndrome, like anxiety, shakiness, sweating, and increased heart rate. Sometimes the symptoms can actually be even more severe, like hallucinations or seizures. Okay, so that was a bit of a detour, but the question remains, is it the same for pornography?
Everything's got addictive qualities. Coffee's got addictive qualities, but nobody vomits, nobody has delirium trends, nobody hallucinates, nobody has sweats when they stop masturbating.
Okay, well, what about other parallels that we can draw between what pornography addiction is and the traditional addiction model?
We also don't see the escalation that people talk about. So when somebody's doing opioids, they need bigger and bigger doses. There's a dose effect. We don't see the dose effect. And people say, well, it escalates into all kinds of, more serious and devious kinds of porn. It certainly will spread out in the same way you can't listen to your favorite song or even your favorite group exclusively. You'll start listening to other people who do similar kinds of music, and then you might try another kind of music. You don't eat the same food. If you do, you get bored and you start trying other kinds of food. Well, same thing with sexually explicit images. Okay, this might be interesting, that might be interesting, I'll try these things. People very seldom, the percentage of stuff with violence is very low. It appeals to a small percentage of people.
This is an important point, as it addresses one of the major ideas present in the porn addiction narrative, that people develop tolerance to normal porn and need to watch more porn or extreme porn, the latter of which is thought to be so extreme that it verges on being unethical.
So we don't see the dose effect, we don't see the withdrawal, we don't see the kind of damage. In most of the DSM, it also has to have a negative impact on your academics, on your social life, on your work, on important areas of your life. Well, other than relationships, we don't see it affecting people's work. We don't see it affecting, except to the extent that, okay, I'm so depressed because my partner is leaving me or I'm in conflict. Okay, but the only time that we do see it affecting work, and I think I've had a handful of clients like this, where they were compulsive masturbators with or without sexually explicit material, and they would sneak off to the closet, they would sneak off to the bathroom, and they would be masturbating 8 or 10 times a day, and sometimes at work, and that wasn't working. But even then, we didn't approach it from an addiction point of view. We looked at what's going on in their lives, and they were anxious about losing their jobs, or they're anxious about their religious beliefs, or they were anxious about other things. Once we dealt with that anxiety, the compulsion to masturbate started to evaporate.
So I'm Dr. David Ley. I'm a clinical psychologist in Albuquerque, New Mexico. With the last name Ley, I really only had two options. I could be a sex doctor or a politician involved in a sex scandal. I really looked closely at that last one, but ultimately I think I made a better choice.
In addition to treating sexuality issues throughout his career, Dr. Ley is a widely known clinical psychologist that frequently writes about and discusses his opposition to the notion of porn addiction. He's the author of popular books such as Ethical Porn for Dicks, Insatiable Wives, and The Myth of Porn Addiction. Throughout our discussion, Dr. Ley touches on porn addiction and sex addiction. Although the two are not interchangeable, and each has its own cultural and social contributing factors, they are in fact closely related. Next, Dr. Ley discusses his early encounters with media inquiry and how the media received his firm stance that sex or porn addiction is not really a thing.
The media was really interested in that. They said, "You don't? Everybody else does." Well, it's not. It's not in the DSM. It's not. It's not diagnosable, and it's not mainstream psychology. So no. Now, again, being a self-referential guy, I said, well, maybe I'm wrong. And so I spent another 1.5 years, 2 years, interviewing and reviewing and all the research, all the literature about sex addiction. And I ended up with a second book called The Myth of Sex Addiction, where I really argued that the concept of sex addiction at a macro level is doing the same thing that I did as a clinician when I encountered the sexuality that I was unfamiliar with. The concept of sex addiction is allowing moral and social biases around sexuality, around monogamy, around heterosexuality to intrude into clinical thinking. So when we look at the concept of sex addiction, that's one of the things that we're really kind of learning now, is that The idea of sex addiction was born basically in the early 1980s when the AIDS crisis was happening. And all of a sudden, people were terrified of sexuality and promiscuous sexuality that could now result in death. Those folks were really struggling to control their sexual desires, particularly gay and bisexual men, because of course it was male homosexuality that was associated with death and disease with AIDS. So those folks were really struggling, and they ended up talking kind of to addictions therapists who said, look, what if we just kind of treat the desire for sex like a craving for drugs and alcohol? And it kind of worked. It kind of offered some social support, and it gave people some hope that they could, be more conscious and control their sexual behaviors. But now, about 40 years later, there's a lot that we know about the idea of sex addiction that helps us to understand clinically, scientifically, it's time to move on. That the concept has really lost much of the value, and unfortunately, it has brought along a lot of problems.
Dr. Ley goes on to discuss how gay men are actually at 3 times higher risk for being called sex addicts than anyone else, and that, in fact, some sex addiction treatment programs identify homosexual desires as being addictive, and that they are things to be treated like a disease.
90 to 95% of sex addicts in treatment are men. Interestingly, half of those men are white, heterosexual, married, religious men who make over $100,000 a year. So it's a unique kind of group that all of a sudden have been offered this diagnosis. Now, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, wealthy, powerful men have been allowed to have as much sex and as, harems and mistresses as they wanted. Now, thanks to feminism, the rules have changed, and we no longer allow those powerful men to engage in these kinds of behaviors without accountability. And suddenly the idea of sex addiction now offers this get out of jail card where the man gets in trouble for putting his penis somewhere he's not supposed to put it and goes to sex addiction summer camp where then he and everybody else can kind of pretend, oh, it's all better. The sex made him do it, and now he's not going to do that anymore.
But it's not as simple as just these two groups. Homosexual men that have labeled themselves as sex addicts in the hopes to rid themselves of their desires, or wealthy, powerful men trying to find a cop-out excuse to weasel their way out of accountability for their actions. There's another factor that Dr. Ley will discuss, previously mentioned also by Dr. Guy, that cannot be ignored.
90% of alleged sex addicts have a major mental health condition, typically anxiety disorders or mood disorders. And what we see is that these are men, typically, who don't have many other sophisticated coping styles or coping mechanisms to deal with things like stress or anxiety. Orgasm and masturbation and sexuality is a really effective way to change how you feel when you are struggling with depression and stress. What these guys need is support in developing new coping strategies. Unfortunately, when these men get labeled as a sex addict, they don't get treatment for the anxiety or depression that is actually causing the problem, and they get told, stop the sex. Well, what that means is then we're taking away the single coping strategy that they've got. We're also diagnosing and treating a symptom rather than the real issue here. If I walk into my doctor's office and I'm sneezing, my doctor doesn't say, David, you got a sneezing addiction. Instead, my doctor, tries to figure out, do I have bacterial infection? Do I have a virus? Do I have allergies? And we have to treat each of those differently. The idea of sex addiction is this one-size-fits-all kind of, when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail kind of strategy. So they apply that label and concept of sex addiction to all of these sexual problems, regardless of all these different origins and causes.
Okay, so based off of what both Dr. Guy and Dr. Ley have said, we understand that there's usually an underlying problem that manifests itself as a need for a coping mechanism. Now, this shouldn't really be an issue, right? You have a problem and then you cope with it through porn and masturbation. You might say that there's really nothing wrong with that. But the problem is that people believe that there's something wrong with that. For some, there's a cognitive or moral dissonance that comes with using porn to cope. The basic idea is that people become distressed due to the discordance between porn use and their own moral beliefs. And that distress, like feelings of shame or anxiety, is reconceptualized as addiction or dysregulated porn use.
That religious issue is what we identify as one of the most significant kind of factors right now. The self-identity or the self-perception of being addicted to pornography or being addicted to sex comes not from sexual frequency and not from a high frequency of porn consumption. Sex and porn addicts don't have more sex than anybody else. They don't watch more porn than anybody else. They feel worse about it. And the reason that they feel worse about it, according to all the research at this point, is because of a moral conflict. It is because of a values incongruency between the way they were taught to be sexual as children and the kind of sex they want to have. Research with self-identified, sex addicts and porn addicts shows that at this point, there's no evidence that they have more significant levels of behavioral discontrol. They are not any more unable to control their sexual behaviors than anybody else. But as I said, they feel worse about it. Now, those folks deserve help. The problem is that the help they need is to resolve that conflict, to help them understand the origins of these feelings of lack of control, to examine their values, and to learn about where these behaviors kind of come from. Unfortunately, because there's such a lack of sexual education around most of these issues, many people find themselves attempting to suppress thoughts or behaviors that are sexual, that are very, very normal. One young man came to me. He was 18 years old. He was concerned. He was addicted to masturbation. He was not showering because he couldn't be alone with his own naked body and trust himself. So I asked the guy, hey, dude, how often you jerking off? And he said, once a week. But once a week masturbation is actually less than normal for many people. And he was afraid of it and felt like it was an addiction because he'd been taught that any masturbation was unhealthy. Any masturbation was sinful. And now he's away from his religious family and he's at college and he's figuring out his own body, his own sexuality, his own life, his own values, and he had no framework to understand it. So we had to do a lot of education around helping him to normalize these sexual feelings. And the more we view these feelings as normal, the more we can understand them, and actually the more effectively we can manage them.
Dr. Ley brings up an interesting point here. People who experience a strongly religious upbringing may feel a greater aversion to sexual release, only because that struggle between the fundamental values that have been ingrained into their identity and their desire to give in to their lustful temptations in the present moment. The friction between these two entities is what makes them perceive their behaviors as pathological, even if they don't necessarily masturbate any more frequently or compulsively than the average person. It's like people are pitting their own moral framework against their biology, when biology is destined to triumph at the end of the day. But we can't forget that there's also the argument that porn itself affects your biology. Just like how snorting cocaine activates the reward pathway in your brain to give you pleasure by bathing your brain cells in dopamine, porn can act in the same way. But in cocaine users, their brain gets used to the constant supply of dopamine and becomes less responsive to it. So they need to use more and more to get their fix. That's how addiction develops. Porn can gradually decrease your pleasure response, which makes you keep going back for more. Or is it the other way around?
It's said very well, if you declare war on your own sexuality, you're going to lose. And one of the things that is coming out of a lot of this research is that people who have higher levels of sensation seeking, who, are adrenaline junkie kind of people. Neurological research indicates that their brains look a little bit different from the brains of people who are less sensation seeking. That the brains of people with higher levels of sensation seeking, are a little less sensitive or responsive to some of the neurochemicals, that are released in our brains during these experiences. It takes them longer to reach a feeling of satiation from this experience. Some people can ride a roller coaster 3 or 4 times in a row and have a great time. I'm a person that halfway through the roller coaster, I'm done, I'm ready to get off. The higher levels of sensation seeking lead people to pursue these kinds of behaviors because that's the way their brain was made. We find exactly that with regards to sexuality and pornography. People who watch more pornography tend to be people who have higher levels of sensation seeking, have higher levels of libido, and are pursuing those behaviors, those experiences, because of the brain that they brought to the dance. Unfortunately, because most research around these issues is correlational, so it's a snapshot in time, we don't know really what came before. There's been research where people said, oh my God, look, the brains of people who watch lots of pornography look different than the brains of people who don't watch much pornography. See, pornography is bad for your brain, when in fact it's the other way around. They already had that kind of brain when they started watching pornography. That's why they were drawn to it. So we can better understand these people who are struggling with, watching lots of pornography, or who are pursuing these, kind of high-end, stimulating sexual experiences, by understanding them as a person, rather than trying to separate the sexuality from all of this other stuff.
These are all very interesting points, and Dr. Ley really highlights the importance of understanding correlation versus causation. Unfortunately, correlational results can yield very sexy headlines. When we see 2 lines on a graph growing upwards together, or 2 differently colored bars on a bar graph moving across the page in tandem, we want to believe that a causal relationship exists. But to illustrate how correlation does not mean causation, we wanted to provide you with some hard-hitting examples. Number 1, did you know that between the years 1999 and 2009, the number of people who had drowned by falling in a pool positively correlated with the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in? Or, our next example, that the divorce rate in Maine is positively correlated to the per capita consumption of margarine. Obviously, these variables, although strongly correlated, are completely unrelated apart from correlational statistics. These examples are courtesy of Tyler Vigen's website Spurious Correlations. If you want to hear more weird correlations, check out his site. Our next and final guest is Dr. William Fisher. He's a professor at Western University, and actually, some of our team members have been lucky enough to take his course, Human Sexuality, as part of our undergraduate studies.
I'm William Fisher. I'm a distinguished professor of psychology. That's the rank they gave me when I aged in place. Cross-appointed to the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I've been doing research funded by the US NIH, CIHR, and SSHRC on sexual and reproductive health behavior for 4 decades.
What are some of your research interests?
Well, my first paper on the subject of pornography was published in 1978, and I've continued to work in that area over the years. Recently, I've published several papers on the impact or non-impact of pornography on the couple, and I've been invited to provide testimony to the Parliament of Canada concerning pornography.
So, what we're really here to talk about today is porn addiction, and you mentioned that you study the effect of pornography on the couple. Mm-hmm. So how would you say porn consumption affects relationship dynamics and perhaps vice versa?
Well, I think the broader question, if you want to circle back to porn addiction, we can talk about that head on. The work that has been done on the impact of pornography on the couple is a snapshot of the biases that have been brought to the field. So, for example, you'll frequently see cross-sectional, one-point-in-time correlational studies saying people who use a lot of pornography are unhappy in their relationships. And the unthinking interpretation is that pornography has caused relationship unhappiness. Of course, it's equally plausible that relationship unhappiness has caused an individual to retreat into pornography. There's very little evidence that pornography causes relationship unhappiness, but the narrative is very strong. When we look closely at this, we found that there were two characteristics of the existing research, in addition to the fact that it's correlational, cross-sectional, and you could interpret it either direction you want. The first is that the research was almost completely harm-focused. So within the cross-sectional, don't know what causes what context, investigators imposed their narrative on the research design. How has this hurt you? Has it given you unrealistic expectations? Has it lessened your love for your partner? And it was quite biased. So we came along and did an amazingly low-tech study. We recruited from the internet people who were recruited in response to an ad that says, does your partner use pornography without you? Or do you use pornography without your partner? Or do the two of you use pornography together? And then we did an unbiased thing. We said, in an open-ended question, has pornography had any positive or negative effect on your relationship? And by a massive multiple, the most common answer was no effect. Then we said, has it had any positive or negative effects? And we had a long list, and we've published this paper, I could give you a reference to it, a long list of positive effects. It's provided an opportunity for us to exchange thoughts and ideas and verbalizations about sexuality that we wouldn't otherwise have had. It's provided a sexual outlet for my partner because we've been together for a while, we want to spice things up, etc. And then the tail end, there were people who said, this creates unrealistic expectations. There were a few of them, and they didn't really expand on that, but there were some people who said that. There were a couple of people who said it destroyed my relationship. But the overwhelming answer was no effect, and then a series of actually unexpectedly positive effects. So the sort of overarching characteristic of research in pornography, unfortunately, is that it tends to be harm-focused, and it tends to be interpreted within a causal narrative that isn't justified by the data.
Recall from the beginning of this episode when we discussed the liking part of the brain versus the wanting part of the brain, and how each of these areas decrease and increase respectively in the addiction setting. Even though the response to the idea of porn addiction has been pretty much unanimously negative throughout this episode, this concept is true.
From a medical perspective, of course, addiction has a very specific meaning. It has to do with a move from liking to craving or needing. It has very, very specific neuroadaptive characteristics. That is, it changes neurochemistry and brain function. It also has issues of withdrawal. And in relation to a formal definition of addiction, there's no evidence that pornography is addictive. Okay, there's no evidence of withdrawal, no evidence of neuroadaptive changes that are any different from the changes that occur when you do something that you like. So the kind of neuroadaptive change you'll see on an MRI in someone watching pornography who likes pornography is pretty much the same as you'll see when somebody looks at pictures of a delicious dessert, or when you look at a University of Florida sports fan watching a Gators game from their beloved sports team. So there's been a lot of drift in the concept of addiction. There are two levels at which one should judge the appropriateness of the use of the term addiction. One is, is the science in order? Does it conform to what might be a consensus definition of addiction? The other is it helpful? Okay, is it helpful in a diagnostic sense? Is it a therapeutically advantageous diagnosis? Does it help me stick handle? I love that word because I can't use it when I go to the States. Does it help me stick handle patient management? One of my senior graduate students, and they're all brilliant, one of them is dealing heavily with consent. The other is dealing with the whole notion of hyperactive hypersexuality, which is really what we're talking about. And her research explores the issue of whether we're really dealing with something that is much better understood in terms of other personality characteristics. Are we dealing with compulsiveness? Are we dealing with obsessiveness? Are we dealing with sex drive? When you give the 5 most common measures of hypersexual disorder to university undergraduates, up to 40% of them score as hypersexually disordered. Okay, when you look at the hypersexuality diagnosis, quite frankly, when you look at porn addiction, what you're really doing is you're diagnosing adolescence. If you look at the modal frequency of male masturbation behavior in the late teens is once a day. If you look at female masturbation data in the late teens, it might be once or twice a week. Both of those could be construed as problematic. I would argue that there's little or no evidence base to diagnose people with pornography addiction. It doesn't have much relation to the therapeutic interventions that they're given, and the therapeutic interventions are not really evidence-based either. So it's a cottage industry. Most of the papers in the area actually don't mention data. Only 27% of the papers in a review of the literature actually mention data. So it's problematic. One perspective would be that exposure to violent pornography would result in violent and anti-woman sexual enactments. We've done a fair amount of research on the idea that it will be high-risk men who are misogynists, delinquents, sociopaths. That very small fragment of men may be especially affected by pornography. There's one study that suggests that's the case. Our study replicated that, but then we said, what happens if we take into account intensity of sex drive? And what we found is that highly misogynistic delinquent men, young men, with a high sex drive actually report more sexual aggression, and pornography has no role. Right now, we are conducting SSHRC-funded nationally representative research where we're testing this proposition in 1,000 young men who are students and 1,000 young men who aren't students. The best answer I can give you with respect to pornography and aggression right now is that whether we know it or not, we're all participants in a gigantic natural experiment that began in 1995. What does that mean? Beginning in about 1995, pornography of every single type became universally accessible on the internet. And I wrote a paper, I said, this might be a problem, because unlike being trapped with the dirty magazines of the day, an individual, particularly an anti-woman individual, can create his or indeed her own sexual stimulus array that might exaggerate antisocial tendencies. Now, when you look at the quote-unquote natural experiment of 25 years plus minus unlimited accessibility to exactly the kind of pornography that you may wish to tailor into your own bookmark list, what you see in both the United States and in Canada is a steep decline, repeat, a steep decline in victimization-reported sexual coercion. And that's not police reports, which are massively underreported. What that is both in the U.S. and in Canada, the government goes out to large samples of men and women. It's active surveillance. It says, have you experienced this in the last year? Have you experienced that in the last year? And what you see is actually a steep decline. I'm not going to argue that the availability of pornography has caused a steep decline, but I'm going to say that if there were a robust impact of pornography in elevating aggression, you might not see that. Now, it does not rule out the possibility that there's a small core of men who are affected by this that are lost in the great majority of men. But when you want to establish a policy, for example, on population-wide regulation, you look at population data. So if you want to know whether raising the cost of cigarettes reduces the number of smokers, you look at everybody. Now, a certain proportion of them may be affected in one way or the other, but overall. So we don't tend to see, either in the U.S. or in Canada, anything but a decline in victimization, active surveillance reported sexual coercion since the inception of universal availability of pornography. With respect to pornography's impact on relationships, what do you see? You see, since the inception of internet access to pornography, a fairly regular decline.
Okay, so if not porn, then what is it that's leading to sexual aggression and violence? Everyone alive today is capable of committing acts of violence against their partner in a sexual context. So why do some people do it and others not? Dr. Fisher and his research team sought to investigate this issue by doing a study on hundreds of young university students.
Tell us exactly what was done. Tell us exactly what was said during your last novel, that is, first-time sexual experience with a new partner. And the fact that not one person engaged in anything we could identify as active, verbal, clear, affirmative consent, that tells us where we got to start. These guys were not porn addicts. These guys were following what is sadly the normative script, which is a dishonest seduction script where one party doesn't want to ask the other and say something, I'm attracted to you, would you like to have sex? One party doesn't want to botch what they regard as a perfect seduction. The other person doesn't want to appear too easy. So we've got a lot of work to do. If I thought porn addiction was at the root of sexual dysfunction, aggression, relationship distortion, and brain changes, I'd say so. But there are a lot more proximate causes. The problems are real. The most effective way to address them remains a discussion that is more complex. We find that almost everyone is aware of affirmative consent, and no one wants to do it. It's not an information problem, it's a motivation problem. It would be awkward. It would be awkward. And I think the subtext, there are at least three subtexts. It would be awkward. It might reduce my chances of success. It might cost me something to agree in terms of reputation. It's okay for me to be swept off my feet, but not to agree in a cold-blooded way. And I'm even beginning to see concern that it might be perceived, this business of active proposition, active consent, would you like to, might be perceived as unwanted sexual attention. And yet it's difficult to engage in active affirmative consent if you didn't raise the issue. So one must be, cautious and judicious about this. One should never raise this issue with someone over whom you have power. One should never raise this issue with an inappropriate other. But there are probably horizontal things, where, it still could be feared that this would, so it's complicated. And our work right now is aimed at trying to graft affirmative consent on a normative sexual script where the cardinal sign of consent these days is my partner didn't resist. And I pointed out, your partner not resisting could mean jump my bones. It could mean I've had 10 shots of tequila and I don't know where I am. It could mean I'm terrified of you. Okay, so that's not an unambiguous sign of consent at all. But that's what people interpret, lack of resistance. And that's a problem. That's a real problem.
Next, Dr. Fisher discusses a classic study done on the negative effects of porn. The setup is this. Imagine you're a guy, a first-year university student that signs up to take part in a study. And when you get to the building, you're brought into a room with a female. You're asked to write an essay on the legalization of marijuana. When the female grades your essay, she tells you how terrible it is, calls you stupid, and says, I'm going to be surprised if you make it here past first year. To make matters worse, she then gives you 9 painful electric shocks. In the other set of experimental conditions, the female treats you very nicely and doesn't shock you at all. Then, the female leaves the room and is instructed to memorize a list of nonsense words. If you were in the set of conditions where she shocked you, you're then exposed to 5 minutes of violent rape-themed pornography. Then, when the female comes back, you're asked to shock her every time she makes a mistake from memorizing the random list of words, and are given the option to send either non-intense or intense shocks.
The men who've seen the violent pornography send much more intense shocks than the men who haven't seen violent pornography, haven't been aggressed against, okay? Haven't been tormented. There is no opportunity for the male to do anything but send electrical shock. And the man is not actually think he's aggressing. Aggression involves hurting a harm-avoided recipient. He's told he's a teacher, okay? Be that as it may, I had problems with this classic study, which was entered into trial in the mid-'80s, and I said, you know what? This guy is not given any opportunity to do anything but aggress. What would happen if they could just walk away? So we got the original stimuli, we got the original shock generator, and we replicated the study, except we gave the male who had been physically tormented with electric shock and verbally humiliated, we gave him the opportunity to send electrical shock to the woman, or talk to her on an intercom, or just go on to the debriefing and end the study. And essentially no male aggressed, okay, because he had the option not to aggress. And they no longer use the experimental paradigm that I talked about. So it's a very, very, unfortunately, biased area. I mean, you know, this was not a good simulation of the response options that anyone has available to them in natural settings at so many levels. I mean, you could run an experimental bias class based on this sole study. So there you have it.
So even the men who viewed the violent pornography chose not to deliver a shock.
There were about 16 men in the critical condition. 2 of them chose to aggress. At the beginning of the study, when we obtained informed consent, we showed the men the shock apparatus. They hadn't seen anything yet. They hadn't met a woman. They hadn't seen pornography. We showed them the apparatus. And we said, you may be asked to send shock. One of the men was a computer science, he identified himself as a hacker. The other was an engineering student. Both of them, and we've recorded this was an old study in 1995, both of them said, can't wait to use the shock generator. And we report this in our published study. But of the men who didn't indicate an initial interest in sending shock, but who waited to see the pornography, not a single one sent shock. I want to say one more thing about the addiction model. There's evidence to suggest that the addiction model has 2 negative effects. One, it relieves individuals of personal responsibility. That can mean I've got enough money to shield behind this and excuse my sexual misbehavior as a medical addiction. And there's no legitimacy to that, but people who can try to use that. The other is data to suggest that when people believe they have a medical or a quasi-medical diagnosis, they tend not to engage in self-help behaviors. They become torpid recipients of medical care. And that may not be a good thing.
And for those that do seek medical or professional attention in an effort to deal with their behavior, what are the options and are they any good? In the US and Canada, the number of private rehabs, meaning the user either has their private insurance pay or they fork it up out of pocket, has skyrocketed in the past decade. Many people are concerned because there's now not much regulation of these rehabs and arguably not much science backing them up either. Some call the addiction treatment industry a cash cow business that gets rich at the expense of their customers.
It has spawned a cottage industry such that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of residential and non-residential care facilities that will happily take your large amounts of money in order to rehabilitate you from your pornography addiction using therapies that have no evidence base whatsoever. There tends to be a correlation between public visibility, being a Harvey Weinstein, having deep pockets, and excusing your sexual misbehavior as the result of an addiction. If that makes you feel better, then fine, but it doesn't give it scientific credibility. Are we shamed enough and deceptive enough about sexuality that we don't teach our kids about it? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. We didn't with the new curriculum, we didn't with the old curriculum. Are we shamed enough and deceptive enough that seduction is a fundamentally dishonest activity that obviates affirmative consent? Yes. Can pornography objectify people? Yes. Do you sometimes want to be an object? Yeah. Do you sometimes not want to be an object? Yeah. I think we need to start having a conversation. And, the worst that can happen is we turn pornography into an educable moment where men and women, boys and girls, men and men, girls and girls, parents and children start talking to each other.
So there you have it. Based on our research and the expert opinion of our guests, we can say that we're pretty convinced that porn addiction is probably not a thing. While we really commend people who are part of the NoFap and fight the new drug movement for investing in self-improvement, we're not totally convinced by the current anti-porn science that's out there. In fact, we've learned a lot about how porn can actually be helpful and about the importance of sexual education in preventing problems like coercive sex, STIs, and unwanted pregnancy. Not only that, but working on this episode made us aware of some pretty shady biases prevalent in the world of porn research. All in all, our team learned a lot about the weird and hugely variable world of pornography while working on this episode, and hope that you did too. Thank you guys for listening. If you'd like to learn more about our podcast, please visit #healthpodcast.com. And remember to like and share #health on social media. This episode was written and produced by Mary Nguyen and me, your host, Nafis Hossain. Interviews were done by Nicole Lam and Michael Huang and Rohan Tangri. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, this is #Health.